Walking through the ruins of an ancient city, you might expect to find grand temples, crumbling palaces, or intricate mosaics. But what if the most sacred objects weren't treasures at all? What if they were the very things we'd consider trash today? Broken pottery, animal bones, even discarded shells, left untouched for centuries, not out of neglect, but out of reverence. This is the mystery we're about to unravel, a world where garbage wasn't just garbage, where ancient trash became sacred, and why it was never removed. Picture this, a bustling marketplace thousands of years ago, where every meal, every ritual, every act of daily life left behind traces. But instead of sweeping these remnants away, the people carefully preserved them, not in landfills, but in sacred spaces. These weren't just piles of refuse, they were offerings, messages to the gods, even portals to the divine. Why would a civilization treat its waste as something holy? The answer lies in beliefs so profound, they transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. These ancient Middens, layers of discarded objects, aren't just archaeological sites. They're time capsules of human devotion, fear, and hope. Today, we're going on a journey to uncover the secrets buried in these sacred heaps. From the ritual offerings of Mesopotamia to the symbolic refuse of the Maya, we'll explore how cultures across the globe turned their trash into something timeless. What can these forgotten fragments teach us about the people who left them behind? How did their beliefs about life, death, and the afterlife shape what they chose to preserve or leave untouched? And perhaps most intriguing of all, why do some of these ancient trash piles still stand, undisturbed, after thousands of years? The answers might just change the way you think about the things we throw away and the stories they could tell. This isn't just a tale of archaeology, it's a window into the human soul. So let's dig in. To understand why some ancient societies treated their trash as sacred, we have to step into their worldview, one where objects weren't just things, but vessels of meaning. Take Mesopotamia, where even a shattered statue of a god wasn't tossed aside like rubbish. These broken idols were carefully buried in ritual pits, as if laying a divine being to rest. Why? Because the people believed these fragments still held the essence of the gods they represented. To discard them carelessly would be unthinkable, almost blasphemous. This wasn't just about respect, it was about fear too. Mishandling sacred objects could invite divine wrath, so every fragment, no matter how small, had to be treated with reverence. But it wasn't just about gods. Everyday objects could become sacred through ritual use. A simple clay pot used in a temple offering, once cracked, wasn't thrown in a ditch. It was often placed in a special deposit, sometimes alongside other ritual items. These weren't garbage dumps, they were archives of devotion. Even animal bones took on new meaning. In some cultures, the remains of sacrificial animals weren't just leftovers. They were proof of a pact between humans and the divine, and so they were preserved, not disposed of. This idea stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. In the Andes, ancient peoples buried broken ceremonial pottery in carefully arranged layers, as if the act of placing them in the earth completed their sacred journey. For the Maya, worn-out ritual objects weren't discarded but retired to special caves or cenotes, watery gateways to the underworld, where they continued to serve a spiritual purpose. What we might see as broken and useless, they saw as charged with power, capable of bridging the human and divine worlds long after their physical use ended. This belief in sacred waste forces us to rethink our modern divide between valuable and worthless. For these ancient cultures, nothing was truly garbage if it had touched the realm of the sacred. And that's why so much of this trash survives today, not because it was forgotten, but because it was deliberately left undisturbed, a silent testament to beliefs that saw holiness in the humblest of objects. Religious traditions across the world reveal a surprising truth. What we might dismiss as worthless often held profound spiritual significance. In Hindu temples, for example, the wilted flowers and leftover food offered to deities weren't seen as waste but as prasad, divine blessings transformed through contact with the sacred. These remnants weren't thrown away. They were distributed to devotees or carefully returned to nature, often placed in flowing water as a symbolic return to the divine. This practice wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about completing a cycle of reverence, where even the physical traces of worship carried power. The Aztecs took this concept even further. In their grand temple complexes, the remains of sacrifices, ashes, bones, and ritual objects were often left exactly where they fell. To tidy them up would have been unthinkable, like erasing evidence of communication with the gods. These materials weren't refuse, they were sacred records, physical proof of ceremonies that bridged the human and divine realms. The same principle applied to broken incense burners or shattered effigies used in rituals. Unlike everyday trash, these items were treated with care, sometimes buried in consecrated ground or placed in special repositories. This sacred relationship with waste wasn't limited to temples. In ancient Egypt, the leftover materials from mummification, linen bandages, embalming residues, even the tools used by priests, were often interred in special pits near tombs. These weren't just practical disposals, they were ritual acts ensuring that every fragment tied to the journey of the dead remained part of the sacred process. Even the humble Astrakhan pottery shards used for writing could become holy if they bore the names of gods or prayers. These practices force us to reconsider what sacred really meant to these cultures. It wasn't just about pristine objects or untouched spaces. Holiness could linger in the broken, the used, the seemingly insignificant. By preserving what modern eyes might call trash, ancient societies were honoring the idea that the divine could inhabit anything, even the remnants of ritual. This worldview didn't just shape their disposal habits, it transformed entire landscapes, turning Middens into monuments and refuse into relics. The connection between waste and worship wasn't just symbolic, it was practical too. In Japan, the Shinto tradition of ohari, or ritual purification, involved gathering impurities, physical and spiritual, into symbolic waste bundles that were then ceremonially discarded or burned. This act wasn't about getting rid of trash, it was about transferring spiritual pollution away from the community. Similarly, in ancient Greece, the remains of sacrificial meals weren't dumped haphazardly but deposited in Bothro's pits, special trenches that served as ritual conduits to the underworld. What unites these traditions is a shared understanding. Nothing that touched the sacred was truly disposable. Whether it was a temple offering in India or a sacrificial remnant in Mexico, these objects carried stories, prayers, and connections that couldn't simply be thrown away. For modern archaeologists, these sacred trash heaps are gold mines of information, but for the people who created them, they were something far deeper, testaments to a world where the line between the mundane and the divine was always blurred. Buried beneath layers of earth, ancient trash piles hold stories that no written record could ever capture. Take Çatalhöyük, one of the world's earliest cities, where archaeologists have uncovered middens filled with animal bones, charred seeds, and broken tools, each layer a snapshot of daily life from over 9,000 years ago. But these weren't just dumps, they were meticulously maintained, often built up over generations like living archives. The people of Çatalhöyük didn't see these heaps as eyesores but as part of their homes, sometimes even burying their dead within them. Why? Because to them, these accumulations weren't refuse. They were connections to ancestors, physical ties between the living and the spirit world. Similar practices appear across the globe. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous shell middens rise like small mountains along coastlines, some towering over 30 feet high. These weren't careless piles of discarded clams and oysters, but communal projects, built over centuries with deliberate care. For the Coast Salish and other tribes, these shells weren't just leftovers, they were markers of identity, proof of shared meals and ceremonies that bound communities together. Some middens even contain human burials, reinforcing the idea that these spaces blurred the line between the mundane and the sacred. The Inca took this concept even further. At sites like Machu Picchu, archaeologists have found midden layers tucked beneath temples and palaces, as if the waste itself was part of the foundation. This wasn't accidental. By incorporating refuse into sacred architecture, the Inca may have been symbolically anchoring their buildings to the earth, using the remnants of daily life to root their grandest structures in both history and spirituality. Even broken pottery, often tossed into these middens, carried meaning shards bearing the fingerprints of ancestors, fragments that once held offerings to the gods. What makes these ancient trash piles so fascinating isn't just what they contain, but how they were treated. Unlike modern landfills hidden away from sight, many middens were central to community life. In medieval Europe, muck hills near villages weren't just disposal sites but gathering places where people exchanged news, traded goods, and even held festivals. Some cultures believed these mounds housed protective spirits, and disturbing them could bring misfortune. This reverence for refuse challenges our modern assumptions where we see waste. They saw continuity, a tangible link between past and present. The study of middens reveals more than just ancient diets or tools. It uncovers how societies understood their place in the world. For the ancestral pueblones of the American Southwest, trash piles were often placed at the edges of settlements, acting as both physical and spiritual boundaries. These layers of discarded corn cobs, pottery, and ash weren't random. They were carefully positioned to mark the transition between the human world and the wild. Even today, some indigenous communities view midden sites as sacred, urging archaeologists to tread lightly, recognizing that these so-called trash heaps are, in fact, repositories of memory and meaning. So the next time you toss something away, consider this. What if your garbage wasn't just garbage? What if it carried the weight of ritual, the echo of a prayer, or the shadow of an ancestor? For countless ancient cultures, that's exactly what their trash represented, not an end, but a bridge. A bridge between meals and memories, between the living and the dead, between the ordinary and the divine. And that's why so much of it still remains, waiting to tell its story. When an Egyptian pharaoh was laid to rest in his tomb, the walls weren't the only things that spoke of eternity, so did the broken bowls at his feet. These weren't oversights or careless discards. They were deliberate provisions, carefully placed to sustain the dead in the afterlife. Imagine a funeral where trash was as important as treasure, where cracked jars and gnawed bones became sacred supplies for the journey beyond. This wasn't unique to Egypt. From Scandinavia to South America, cultures worldwide buried their dead with what we'd call garbage, revealing a startling truth. To them, these objects weren't waste at all, but transformed. Take Viking burial ships, where warriors were sent to the afterlife surrounded by shattered drinking horns and animal bones from their final feast. These weren't just leftovers, they were spiritual currency, ensuring the deceased wouldn't arrive empty-handed in Valhalla. Even the ship itself, once buried, became a kind of sacred refuse, left to decay as part of the ritual. The same principle appears in China's Han Dynasty. where tombs contained broken tiles and worn coins, objects that had outlived their earthly purpose but gained new meaning in death. Why preserve what seems worthless? Because these cultures saw decay not as an end but as a transition. A broken pot in this world might be whole again in the next. This practice went beyond symbolism. It reflected a cosmology where nothing truly disappeared. The Maya buried their dead with cracked incense burners, believing the smoke could still carry prayers upward. In Peru's Paracas culture, mummies were wrapped in textiles stained with food and dyes, as if life's messiness was part of the sacred bundle. These weren't careless burials, they were acts of faith, treating refuse as relics. But perhaps most striking were the taboos that protected this sacred trash. Disturbing burial refuse wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Egyptian tomb curses warned against removing even a shard, lest it disrupt the dead's passage. Norse sagas spoke of ghosts haunting those who plundered burial ships. These weren't mere superstitions, they were boundaries between worlds. To touch what belonged to the dead was to risk crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. So why did these beliefs persist for millennia? Because they answered a profound human need to make sense of loss. By turning trash into tribute, ancient cultures found continuity in decay. A broken bowl in a tomb wasn't just trash, it was hope. Hope that nothing, not even refuse, was truly left behind. And that's why so much of it remains today, untouched, not abandoned, but waiting. The fear of disturbing sacred trash wasn't just about respect, it was about survival. In ancient Japan, the slightest misstep could anger the kami, the spirits believed to inhabit everything from rocks to rivers. When offerings of rice, sake, or folded paper at shrines decayed over time, no one dared to clear them away. To do so would be like slamming a door in the face of a god. These weren't empty rituals, they were acts of preservation, ensuring the balance between humans and the unseen forces around them. Even a single misplaced step could disrupt that harmony, inviting drought, illness, or worse. The same reverence extended to everyday objects. Broken household items used in rituals weren't tossed out but placed in sacred corners of the home, left to return to the earth on their own terms. This fear of divine retribution wasn't unique to Japan. Along the Pacific Northwest, the Coast Salish people viewed shell middens as living entities, their layers whispering with the voices of ancestors. Disturbing these piles wasn't just taboo, it was unthinkable, like tearing pages from a sacred text. Some tribes believed these mounds housed guardian spirits that would punish anyone who removed so much as a single shell. Archaeologists working in these regions often hear elders speak of curses tied to Midden sites, stories passed down through generations. These weren't ghost tales to frighten children but serious warnings, rooted in a worldview where every object, no matter how small, held a fragment of the sacred. The Inca took this concept to astonishing lengths. At Machu Picchu, waste from ritual feasts was carefully placed in designated pits, never to be touched again. The act of discarding was itself a sacred gesture, a way of feeding the earth as the earth fed them. To dig up these deposits would have been like stealing from the gods, a crime with cosmic consequences. Even the placement of these refuse pits was deliberate, often aligned with celestial events or buried beneath temples, as if to seal their power within the land. What's striking is how these taboos persisted not out of ignorance, but out of a sophisticated understanding of the world. For these cultures, sacred trash was a kind of contract, a physical reminder of promises made to the divine. Breaking that contract wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. Modern science might call it superstition, but to them, it was as real as the ground beneath their feet. That's why, centuries later, so many of these sites remain untouched, not lost to time but preserved by intention. The contrast with today's throwaway culture couldn't be sharper. Where ancient societies saw webs of connection, we often see inconvenience. But perhaps there's something to learn from these old fears, not the superstitions, but the underlying respect for the invisible threads that bind objects, people, and the sacred. After all, when the last plastic bag drifts into the ocean, it carries no prayers, no history, no guardians. Maybe that's the real difference between trash and treasure, not what it's made of, but what it means. The sacred trash piles of the ancient world weren't just spiritual monuments, they were also clever solutions to very real, practical problems. Picture the streets of Rome at the height of its empire, where over 1 million people lived crammed into narrow alleyways. With no garbage trucks or sanitation departments, waste disposal wasn't just inconvenient, it was nearly impossible on such a massive scale. But instead of letting trash overwhelm the city, the Romans did something ingenious. They turned their temples into recycling hubs. Broken pottery, worn-out tools, even animal bones from sacrifices were carefully sorted and repurposed right on sacred grounds. A cracked amphora might become part of a ritual offering, its fragments pressed into temple walls as votive offerings. Worn coins unfit for circulation were melted down to forge sacred amulets. What we'd call recycling, they called worship, a seamless blend of necessity and devotion. This duality wasn't unique to Rome. In the Indus Valley, archaeologists have uncovered entire neighborhoods where household refuse was systematically incorporated into the foundations of new buildings. These weren't careless dumping practices but deliberate acts of urban planning, where broken bricks and pottery shards were mixed with clay to create stronger, more durable structures. The sacred connection, many of these recycled materials bore inscriptions or markings tied to religious rituals, transforming mundane construction into something spiritually significant. Even the act of rebuilding atop old refuse layers may have held symbolic meaning, a literal layering of community memory into the city's bones, but the practicality went deeper than just waste management. In societies without modern landfills, discarding certain materials could be downright dangerous. The Maya, for example, faced a real dilemma with obsidian, a razor-sharp volcanic glass used for tools and rituals. Broken fragments were too hazardous to leave scattered, yet too valuable to throw away. Their solution, sacred pits called choltons, where these dangerous shards were carefully deposited alongside ritual offerings, effectively neutralizing their physical threat while honoring their spiritual potency. Similarly, in medieval Kyoto, temple grounds became safe repositories for discarded needles and broken blades, with special ceremonies held to thank these objects for their service before retiring them. What's fascinating is how these practical solutions often evolved into cherished traditions. Japan's Harakuyo festival, still practiced today, sees people bringing worn-out needles and pins to temples, where they're stuck into blocks of tofu, a symbolic act of gratitude that also prevents injuries from careless disposal. In India, sacred groves near villages often served as de facto composting sites, where organic waste decomposed alongside ritual offerings, creating fertile ground both spiritually and agriculturally. These weren't just clever hacks, they were sustainable systems born from the intersection of reverence and resourcefulness. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this sacred recycling is how it transformed trash into historical records. Unlike modern landfills where everything is mashed together, ancient ritual deposits were often meticulously organized. In Mesopotamian temples, administrative records, broken tablets, worn-out seals were stored in dedicated archives, creating what we'd now call institutional memory. The Aztecs did something similar, carefully layering offerings in temple caches with each new ruler, creating a chronological record of their reign through the objects they left behind. These weren't random accumulations but curated collections where every broken piece told a story. This dual purpose, practical and sacred, challenges our modern separation of utility and spirituality. For these cultures, there was no contradiction in using the same space for worship and waste management, because they saw both acts as part of a greater whole. A temple wasn't diminished by housing broken objects, it was enriched by them, and that perspective might hold a lesson for our own throwaway culture, that what we discard says as much about us as what we keep. Buried beneath layers of earth, ancient trash piles tell stories no king's chronicle could ever capture. Take the humble oyster shell, discarded by a Viking trader after a feast in Hedeby. To him, it was just dinner, but to archaeologists centuries later, that single shell became a roadmap, tracing maritime trade routes from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The calcium carbonate in its curves holds chemical signatures of the waters it came from, revealing how far people traveled for something as simple as a meal. This is the paradox of sacred trash. What was once mundane becomes monumental with time. The Maya left behind similar breadcrumbs in their broken pottery. A charred cooking vessel from Tikal doesn't just show us what people ate, it shows us how they ate. Residue analysis can detect traces of maize, chilies, even chocolate, while soot patterns reveal whether food was simmered or flash-boiled. These fragments are more reliable than any codex because while conquerors burned books, they rarely bothered with trash. The very indifference that preserved these shards makes them priceless. Unlike carefully curated temple offerings, everyday refuse wasn't staged for the gods or future generations. It's raw, unfiltered humanity frozen in clay. Some of the most telling discoveries come from what's missing. In Pompeii's sewer systems, archaeologists found something startling: an absence of fish bones in neighborhoods near the docks. This counterintuitive clue revealed a sophisticated food distribution network. Fresh catches were transported inland to wealthier districts, while dockworkers ate more preserved meats. No historian would have recorded such a mundane detail, but the garbage tells the truth. Even dental records in skeletons corroborate the story, with coastal residents showing fewer telltale marks from gritty seafood diets. What makes these accidental archives so vital is their honesty. A royal monument might proclaim a pharaoh's greatness, but the animal bones in workers' quarters reveal whether they ate well under his rule. At Catalhoyuk, plaster casts of baskets and textiles preserved only because they left impressions in hardened refuse show weaving techniques no surviving artifact could demonstrate. In Mohenjo-Daro, carefully sorted trash pits prove the Indus Valley civilization had municipal waste management millennia before modern cities. These aren't just piles of debris, they're bureaucratic records in disguise. The sheer durability of trash often outlasts intentional preservation. Papyrus rots, wood decays, but a broken olive oil amphora from Roman Britain survives 2,000 years to testify about imperial supply chains. In Greenland's Norse settlements, layers of fly pupae in Middens provide climate data. Their population booms during warm periods, crashes during cold snaps, creating a precise thermometer of the Little Ice Age. Even gnaw marks on bones become historical documents, distinguishing between butchering tools and rodent teeth with forensic precision. Perhaps most remarkably, these refuse heaps preserve voices otherwise erased from history. At Ostia Antiqua, Rome's ancient port, graffiti scratched onto discarded pottery shards records everything from merchant complaints to childish doodles, the social media posts of antiquity. In Egypt's worker villages, beer jars marked with tallies reveal payment systems for pyramid builders. Unlike grand tombs that memorialize elites, garbage democratizes history, preserving the fingerprints of slaves, cooks, and children alongside kings. This unflinching honesty forces us to reconsider what deserves preservation. While archives burn and statues topple, the layers of a Middens stand as uncensored testimony. A broken loom weight in Mycenae tells us about textile workers ignored in epic poems. Fishhooks in Newfoundland's Viking sites rewrite the timeline of transatlantic contact. Every stain, fracture, and scorch mark is a word in a story we're only beginning to decipher, one where the sacred and the scrapped intertwine in unexpected ways. Now consider how these unintentional archives shaped the very cities they were discarded in. From Rome's Cloaca Maxima to the waste-fed gardens of Tenochtitlan, sacred trash didn't just record urban life, it engineered it. The next chapter of our journey takes us into streets where garbage was never just garbage, but the invisible architect of civilization itself. The streets of ancient Jerusalem didn't just lead to the Temple Mount, they were built upon it. Literally, beneath the gleaming stones of Solomon's temple lay something unexpected, layer upon layer of broken pottery, animal bones, and ashes from centuries of rituals. This wasn't careless construction, it was sacred engineering. Each new expansion of the temple complex deliberately incorporated the debris of previous worship, as if the physical act of building required communion with the past. To modern eyes, it might look like dumping trash under a foundation, but to the builders, these layers were a living archive, proof that holiness accumulated over time like sediment. The same principle shaped cities across the ancient world. In Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun didn't just rise from the earth, it consumed it. Archaeologists have discovered that its core contains entire smaller pyramids, swallowed whole during expansions, their facades buried like Russian nesting dolls. But what's truly remarkable are the offerings tucked between these layers, shattered incense burners, worn-out obsidian blades, even the skeletons of sacrificial animals. These weren't construction fill, they were ritual punctuation marks, transforming each phase of growth into a spiritual act. The Maya took this further at Tikal, where rulers ordered the destruction of old temples not to erase them, but to entomb them. Broken stelae were carefully placed in new foundations, their inscriptions hidden but never forgotten, a deliberate fusion of memory and masonry. This sacred recycling reshaped urban landscapes in ways we're only beginning to understand. Rome's Cloaca Maxima, the legendary sewer system, wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a spiritual artery. Ritual objects recovered from its depths suggest Romans viewed waste disposal as a kind of ceremonial cleansing, channeling both physical and spiritual impurities out of the city. In Constantinople, the Hippodrome Spina wasn't just a racecourse divider but a carefully curated display of spolia, reused columns and statues from conquered territories. What we might see as imperial boasting, they saw as sacred integration, binding the old into the new. The contrast with modern urban planning couldn't be starker. Where today's cities hide waste in landfills or incinerators, ancient design celebrated its transformative power. The ziggurat of Ur wasn't built over its predecessors' remains, it was built with them, its bricks stamped with the names of long-dead kings. In Cusco, Inca engineers incorporated worn-out grinding stones into palace walls, turning utilitarian objects into architectural relics. Even everyday waste played a role. At Pompeii, crushed amphorae were mixed into concrete, their curved shards strengthening walls while silently testifying to centuries of olive oil trade. What emerges from these sites is a radical philosophy that cities aren't just built on land but on legacy. The sacred garbage beneath Jerusalem's temples or within Mayan pyramids wasn't clutter, it was connective tissue, physically bonding each generation to the last. Archaeologists now recognize these patterns as deliberate memory infrastructure, designed to outlast empires. When Spanish conquistadors dismantled Aztec temples to build cathedrals, they missed the point entirely. The true sacredness wasn't just in the stones, but in the carefully curated refuse between them. This worldview faced its greatest threat not from time, but from colonialism. European settlers often saw native Midden sites as worthless piles, bulldozing shell mounds in Florida for road fill or looting Peruvian huacas for treasure. The disconnect was profound. Where indigenous cultures saw sanctity in layers of decay, colonizers saw only dirt, yet traces of the old philosophy persist. In Kyoto, temple carpenters still practice iki-ishi, leaving foundation stones slightly unworked, acknowledging the imperfection inherent in transformation. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of sacred urban waste, that true permanence isn't about pristine preservation, but about honoring the beauty in what's broken. When European colonists first encountered the towering shell middens of North America's coastlines, they saw only piles of refuse, evidence of what they called savage habits. What they failed to understand was that these massive accumulations were never meant to be hidden. To the native peoples who built them over centuries, each discarded clam shell and broken tool was a stitch in the fabric of community memory. The colonists' dismissal wasn't just ignorance, it was a collision of worldviews, where indigenous cultures saw sacred continuity, settlers saw disorder, and that misunderstanding had devastating consequences. Take the case of Florida's Turtle Mound, a 60-foot-high shell midden that once stretched for acres along the Atlantic coast. To the Timucua people, it was a living monument, a burial ground, a navigational marker, and a testament to generations of shared meals. But to Spanish missionaries, it was merely a convenient source of lime for mortar. By the 1800s, entire sections had been ground up for construction projects, erasing not just physical layers but the stories they held. Similar destruction unfolded in the Pacific Northwest, where settlers bulldozed shell middens to make way for railroads, oblivious to the fact that these were cemeteries, not dumps. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of artifacts but the severing of living connections. For the Wampanoag of New England, oyster middens weren't relics of the past but active touchstones, places where elders taught children to read shells like history books, tracing climate shifts and migration patterns in their curves. When these sites were looted for souvenir buttons or garden fertilizer, entire oral traditions crumbled. Even well-meaning archaeologists often compounded the harm. In the late 19th century, teams excavating Peruvian huacas meticulously catalogued gold grave goods while tossing aside the ordinary refuse, the very objects that revealed how people lived, worshipped, and traded. Yet today, a quiet revolution is underway. Tribal nations from Louisiana to Alaska are leading efforts to reclaim and rebury sacred refuse. The Mashpee Wampanoag now use ground-penetrating radar to locate and protect shell-midden burials from coastal erosion. In British Columbia, the Heiltsuk Nation partnered with scientists to study ancient fish bones from middens, not as curiosities, but as evidence to support modern land claims, proving their ancestors' stewardship of salmon runs for millennia. These collaborations are flipping the colonial script, treating indigenous waste practices not as primitive habits, but as sophisticated systems of ecological and spiritual knowledge. The lessons for modern society are striking, where our landfills are designed to forget, sealed under layers of plastic and dirt. These ancient models insist on remembering. Japan's zero-waste town of Kamakatsu echoes this philosophy, sorting trash into 45 categories for reuse, its recycling center as meticulously organized as a temple altar. Meanwhile, architects are looking to the Incas' rubble-filled terraces, which stabilized slopes for centuries, as models for sustainable construction. Even our language is shifting. Archaeologists now speak of cultural deposits instead of middens, a small but meaningful step toward respect. Perhaps the deepest wisdom lies in recognizing that nothing is ever truly disposable. Just as a Maya shard carried prayers or a Viking bone held echoes of feasts, today's waste might someday speak for us. The question is, what will it say? Will it tell of heedless consumption, or will it whisper, like those ancient shell piles, of reverence for the threads that bind all things? The choice is ours, but the past has already left its answer. Imagine a landfill not as an endpoint, but as a library, each discarded object holding stories waiting to be reread. This shift in perspective is already happening in surprising ways. In Kamakatsu, Japan, residents sort their trash into 45 distinct categories, transforming what others might see as waste into resources with renewed purpose. It's a modern echo of those ancient middens, where every shell and bone was valued. But the parallels go deeper than recycling bins. Artists like El Anatsui stitch discarded bottle caps into shimmering tapestries that hang in museums, turning litter into literal monuments. These creations don't just repurpose materials, they elevate them, much like how broken temple offerings were once enshrined. Even our digital refuse carries unexpected sacredness. Deleted social media posts, abandoned blogs, and defunct websites are preserved in the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, a kind of digital midden. These virtual fragments aren't just nostalgia, they're evidence of collective memory, much like the pottery shards that revealed ancient trade routes. And just as sacred trash pits held objects considered too powerful to discard carelessly, today's nuclear waste repositories are designed to warn future civilizations away, engraved with symbols and buried deep, as if handling something both dangerous and holy. The environmental movement is rediscovering what ancient cultures knew instinctively, that nothing is truly disposable. Circular economy principles, where materials are endlessly reused, mirror the Maya's ritual recycling of obsidian or the Roman habit of melting down old coins for new sacred amulets. In Sweden, heat from incinerated trash warms homes, a practical alchemy that would have made sense to the Aztecs, who saw energy transformation in their ritual fires. Even composting finds its ancestor in the Olone people's shell mounds, where layers of organic waste enriched the soil for generations. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in how we memorialize waste. The Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb collects discarded love letters and wedding rings, treating emotional trash as worthy of preservation. It's not so different from the Egyptian practice of interring embalming waste near tombs. Both acknowledge that what's broken still holds meaning. Meanwhile, upcycled architecture turns industrial debris into stunning buildings, much like Çatalhöyük's homes built atop ancestral refuse. The challenge now is to bridge ancient reverence with modern scale, where a Maya village might carefully retire one shattered incense burner. Humanity produces over 2 billion tons of solid waste annually. But glimmers of change suggest a way forward. In Bali, the Trash Temple movement cleans beaches and sorts plastic by type before offering it at shrines, a direct fusion of ritual and recycling. Tokyo's Suwa Shrine holds annual ceremonies for dead electronics, acknowledging their service before dismantling them responsibly. These aren't just eco-friendly acts, they're spiritual ones, restoring the sacred thread between use and reuse. What if every landfill came with a storykeeper? What if we mined e-waste with the same reverence as archaeologists sifting through temple deposits? The answers might lie in seeing our trash not as an ending, but as a continuous loop where today's coffee grounds nourish tomorrow's gardens, and yesterday's smartphone becomes next century's artifact. After all, the sacred was never about perfection, but about connection. And in a world drowning in waste, that connection might be our most vital resource. Ancient societies didn't just venerate their trash, they built entire ecosystems around it. The shell middens of coastal tribes weren't just cultural landmarks, they were accidental marine sanctuaries. As these piles grew over centuries, their calcium-rich layers neutralized acidic soils, creating fertile ground for mangroves and seagrasses that sheltered fish nurseries. What modern scientists would call bioremediation, these communities achieved simply by leaving offerings where they fell. The Maya's sacred cenotes functioned similarly. Sinkholes filled with ritual debris became thriving aquatic habitats, their submerged pottery shards providing shelter for blind cavefish. This wasn't just spiritual practice, it was symbiosis where human activity and environmental health became indistinguishable. Compare this to today's plastic-choked oceans and chemical landfills, and the gap in wisdom becomes stark. Where ancient cultures saw refuse as part of nature's cycle, modern industry treats it as something to vanish out of sight, out of mind. But vanishing is an illusion. The very plastics we bury today are resurfacing in Arctic ice cores and desert dust storms, while sacred middens remained localized, their materials chosen precisely because they would harmonize with the landscape. The Pueblo people's turkey pens, lined with carefully layered corn cobs and ash, enriched the soil for generations. Rome's Monte Testaccio, a hill made of 53 million broken olive oil jars, still blooms with Mediterranean herbs 2,000 years later. These weren't dumps, they were designed collaborations with nature. The sustainability lessons here aren't just poetic, they're practical. In Tamil Nadu, temple tanks once served dual purposes: reservoirs for dry seasons and sacred repositories for ritual flowers. As the petals decomposed, they released nutrients that purified the water naturally. Modern engineers are now rediscovering these systems, building living wastewater treatment plants where lotus plants and microorganisms do the work of chemical filters. Similarly, Japan's Satoyama forests, managed for centuries as sources of ritual timber, maintained biodiversity levels rivaling untouched wilderness. By assigning spiritual value to sustainable practices, these cultures encoded ecological wisdom into daily life. What's revolutionary is how these models invert modern assumptions. Contemporary recycling often feels like punishment, sorting bins under fluorescent lights. But when Benin's Yoruba people gathered broken pots for sacred groves, or when Norse farmers spread midden soil on fields as ancestor blessing, waste management became an act of meaning. Archaeologists find that these ritually treated soils show lower heavy metal concentrations than industrial farmlands today. The difference: intentionality. Every object was placed, not dumped, with awareness of its journey beyond human use. Some forward-thinking communities are already blending these old and new approaches. In Bali's trash temple movement, volunteers sort plastic by type before offering it at shrines, a ritual that's recycled over 2 tons of waste monthly. Sweden's heat from trash incinerators now feature stained glass artworks, transforming smokestacks into modern-day ziggurats. Even corporate campuses are taking notes. Google's kitchens compost food waste into employee garden plots, echoing the monastic gardens of medieval Europe where kitchen scraps became sacramental herbs. The most profound shift, though, may be philosophical. Sacred waste systems remind us that sustainability isn't just about technology, it's about relationship. When the Haida people of the Pacific Northwest said a prayer over every hunted seal, using every bone in tools or ritual objects, they weren't just avoiding waste. They were acknowledging a contract with the natural world, one modern ecology is only beginning to articulate. As climate scientists warn of tipping points, perhaps the oldest lesson from these trash heaps is the most urgent. What we call disposable never really goes away. It just waits to be rediscovered as pollution or as prophecy. A child's broken toy, a chipped coffee mug, a cracked smartphone screen, most of us wouldn't think twice before tossing them. But place that same broken mug in an ancient temple, and suddenly it's not trash anymore. It's an artifact, a relic, something sacred. This paradox lies at the heart of how we assign value, not just to objects but to entire cultures. What makes one society's garbage another's treasure? The answer isn't found in the objects themselves, but in the stories we wrap around them. Consider the humble clay pot. To an ancient Mesopotamian, a shattered vessel used in ritual wasn't discarded. It was retired, buried with ceremony, as if it held the echoes of prayers. Fast forward to today, a factory produced bowl chips, and into the bin it goes. The difference isn't in the clay, but in the context. Ancient cultures saw objects as alive with meaning, imbued with history, touched by the divine. Our modern world, by contrast, treats most things as disposable, their worth tied to utility rather than legacy, but there are cracks in this system. Walk through any museum, and you'll find cases filled with what archaeologists call cultural refuse, broken tools, worn coins, even ancient food scraps now displayed like crown jewels. This shift reveals a fascinating truth. Sacredness isn't an inherent quality, but a lens we choose to look through. Take the Aztecs' weathered stone knives, used in sacrifices and then reverently cached. To the conquistadors who found them, they were grotesque relics. To modern historians, they're priceless windows into ritual life. Even within a single culture, perspectives change. Victorian collectors prized pristine Greek vases, tossing fragments aside. Today, those same fragments bearing fingerprints or workshop marks tell richer stories than any unbroken urn. Artists have long understood this fluid boundary between trash and transcendence. Japanese kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold lacquer, celebrating cracks as part of an object's history. Contemporary sculptors like Vic Muniz recreate masterpieces from landfill debris, forcing us to confront what we dismiss. Archaeologists, in their own way, do the same, sifting through Middens not for gold, but for fish bones and seed husks that reveal how ordinary people lived, loved, and worshipped. The intersection of art and archaeology offers a powerful corrective to our throwaway culture. In Mexico City, artists collaborate with anthropologists to display colonial-era trash as installations, revealing how everyday objects carried hidden resistance. At New York's Waste Management Symposium, soil scientists and conceptual artists swap techniques for reading landfill layers like sacred texts. These collaborations remind us that value isn't dictated by market price or pristine condition, but by the narratives we're willing to listen for. Perhaps the most provocative lesson comes from places where this boundary blurs entirely. In Kyoto's temple attics, stacks of worn-out prayer plaques are stored for decades before being ritually burned. Not quite trash, not quite relics, they exist in a liminal space where use and sanctity overlap. Similarly, the Inuit practice of leaving old tools on the tundra for future travelers transforms practical generosity into something spiritual. These traditions suggest a third way beyond our binary of keep or discard, or one where objects cycle through phases of use, rest, and renewal. As we stand ankle-deep in the plastic tides of the 21st century, these ancient perspectives feel less like curiosities and more like urgent correctives. What if we treated today's e-waste with the reverence of ritual objects, or saw landfills as future archaeologists might, as layered testaments to our values? The difference between sacred and trash isn't in the materials, but in the meaning we're willing to grant them. and that's a power we've always held, even if we've forgotten how to use it. In the glittering mosaics of Ravenna's Byzantine churches, saints and angels shine with an unexpected secret. Their halos are made from crushed glass shards, salvaged from broken bottles and discarded vessels. These artisans saw beauty in what others overlooked, transforming refuse into radiance. Centuries later, their approach resonates in modern artists like El Anatsui, whose towering tapestries of flattened bottle caps drape over museum walls like molten gold. The connection is no accident. Across time and cultures, creators have returned to society's cast-offs as both medium and message, proving that trash was never just trash. It was always potential waiting to be unlocked. Take the intricate Zellige tilework of Moroccan mosques, where chipped ceramic fragments are painstakingly arranged into geometric wonders. What began as a practical solution reusing broken household pottery became a sacred art form, each tessera carrying whispers of its past life. Similarly, Edo period Japan's Baroque textiles stitched together rags and worn-out kimono into patchwork masterpieces, their frayed edges testifying to generations of repair. These weren't just recycling efforts, they were acts of reverence honoring the energy already invested in each fragment. Contemporary artists push this tradition further, using waste to hold up a mirror to modern excess. Portuguese artist Bordello Roman II constructs vibrant animal sculptures from shredded tires and electronic waste, their forms emerging from the very materials threatening real ecosystems. In Mumbai, Sudarshan Shetty's installation of thousands of broken kitchen plates cascading like waterfalls turns domestic debris into a meditation on impermanence. Like the ritual deposits of ancient Mesopotamia, these works force us to confront what we'd rather ignore: the afterlife of the objects we discard. The most compelling creations blur the line between art and artifact. Mexican artist Teresa Margolles fills gallery floors with shattered windshield glass from crime scenes, each glittering shard bearing invisible histories of violence. It's a practice eerily reminiscent of Roman curse tablets, lead scraps etched with angry messages, folded and tossed into sacred springs to summon divine justice. Both use brokenness as a language, transforming debris into vessels for collective memory. This artistic alchemy reveals a universal truth: when materials outlive their original purpose, they don't cease to matter, they simply await reinterpretation. The stained glass of medieval cathedrals often contained recycled Roman glassware, just as today's e-waste jewelry repurposes circuit boards into wearable heirlooms. Perhaps this is why landfill mining has become an unlikely art movement, with creators like Vic Muniz sculpting masterpieces from garbage to challenge our perceptions of value. Folklore takes this concept even further, weaving sacred trash into the very fabric of cultural memory. In Irish myths, broken weapons buried at river crossings were said to ward off evil spirits, while Scandinavian legends spoke of midden-dwelling elves who cursed those who disturbed their homes. These stories weren't mere superstitions, they were ecological wisdom disguised as fantasy, teaching respect for what lay discarded. From Anansi's trickster tales in West Africa to Native American coyote stories, oral traditions worldwide whisper the same lesson: nothing is ever truly gone, only transformed. Folklore breathes life into what we might dismiss as lifeless debris. Across Celtic villages, whispers told of the Bodachan Sabhale tiny, wrinkled spirits said to dwell in ancient Middens, punishing anyone who disturbed their homes with misfortunes from spoiled crops to sudden illness. These weren't just ghost stories, they were ecological guardrails, using fear to protect sites where generations of shells and bones held ancestral memory. In Ireland, farmers avoided ploughing near fairy forts, not because they feared the supernatural, but because those mounds often concealed sacred refuse pits. Disrupting them meant erasing history, a sin worse than any curse. Slavic traditions took this reverence further. A broken comb tossed into a ritual fire wasn't just trash, it became a vessel for Nav, the spirit of the dead. To move it risked severing a soul's connection to the living. In the Carpathian Mountains, housewives carefully buried worn-out ritual tools beneath doorsteps, believing their accumulated power would shield the home. These practices reveal a profound truth. Where modern science sees decay, folklore saw transformation. A rusted sickle left in a field wasn't abandoned, it was retired, its labor transmuted into spiritual protection. The psychological weight of these taboos becomes clear in the Arctic, where Inuit hunters still leave the skulls of harvested seals on ice floes. Old stories say the seals' souls will rebirth only if their bones return to the sea, a belief so potent that even colonial whalers adopted the practice, finding it improved hunt success. Similarly, in Japan, discarded needles were given hare-kuyo memorials, pinned into tofu to ease their pain after years of service. These rituals didn't just honor objects, they acknowledged the invisible threads between use and consequence. Contrast these with the cautionary tales of disturbed trash. Baltic folklore warns of Korkai, mischievous spirits inhabiting old kiln debris, who curse those who scatter their ash piles with endless bad luck. A Welsh legend tells of a farmer who plowed up a midden, only to watch his fields wither until a druid instructed him to return every shard, down to the smallest snail shell. Such stories functioned as oral contracts with the past, binding communities to preservation through narrative stakes far heavier than any law. The magic of these tales lies in their duality. A Yoruba proverb says, "The broken pot still holds the name of its maker," encapsulating how even fragmented objects retain identity. This idea echoes in modern salvage archaeology, where a single charred seed from a Viking midden can rewrite trade routes. Perhaps that's why sacred trash appears so often in creation myths like the Maori story where the god Tain fashions the first woman from red ochre-stained earth, literally sculpting humanity from ritual waste. These narratives don't just explain the world, they sanctify its leftovers, turning what's cast aside into the cornerstone of culture. Religious texts will later formalize these instincts, but the heartbeat of sacred trash pulses earliest in folklore, where every cracked pot had a guardian, and every ash pile hid a story waiting to be remembered. Sacred texts hold unexpected wisdom about what most cultures would dismiss as worthless. In the Talmud, a shattered ritual vessel isn't just a broken cup, it's called a sheva kelai sharet, a sacred fragment that must be buried like a Torah scroll too damaged to use. This wasn't about nostalgia, it was theology in action. The same principle appears in Hinduism's Manusmriti, which dictates that flower offerings to deities shouldn't be tossed aside but returned to flowing water, completing a cycle of reverence. Even the Quran's teachings on cleanliness include surprising nuanced discarded date pits from Sufi meditation sessions were often collected and burned in special ceremonies, their smoke believed to carry prayers upward. These doctrines reveal a profound truth. Sacred trash wasn't an afterthought but a carefully considered part of spiritual practice. Buddhist monasteries in Tibet still follow ancient protocols for retiring prayer flags. Faded fabrics aren't thrown away but ritually burned, their ashes mixed with clay to form tsaatsa votive figurines. Similarly, Zoroastrian texts prescribe exact methods for disposing of nail clippings and hair, lest they fall into the hands of dark spirits. What might seem like obsessive hygiene was actually a cosmic safeguard, treating even bodily refuse as spiritually charged. The Bible offers its own unexpected examples. In Jeremiah, a potter's discarded clay becomes a metaphor for divine sovereignty reshaped rather than wasted. Early Christian catacombs reveal broken communion vessels carefully interred with martyrs, their fractures testifying to shared meals rather than neglect. Even the potter's field, where Judah's silver was used to purchase land for burying strangers, Matthew 27, transformed tainted money into sacred ground, a literal redemption of refuse. These texts didn't just regulate waste, they redefined it. Islamic hadiths warn against stepping on breadcrumbs, seeing them as divine provision deserving respect. Jewish laws, Geniza tradition required worn-out scriptures to be stored in attics or buried, never destroyed, a practice that accidentally preserved centuries of documents in Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue. From Taoist alchemists who reused ritual ash in medicinal compounds to seek langar kitchens where food waste is composted as service, scripture turned disposal into devotion. The domestic sphere absorbed these teachings in intimate ways. A medieval Christian household might bury broken saint statues in the garden, turning them into unofficial shrine markers. Hindu families still set aside a corner of the yard for Shuddhikaran, purifying old ritual items with turmeric and water before disposal. In Japan, Shinto homes enshrine broken needles in tofu during Hare Kuyo, thanking them for years of service. These weren't chores but ceremonies, blurring the line between housework and worship. What emerges is a radical challenge to modern waste habits. Where we see expired objects, these traditions saw transitions, from practical use to spiritual purpose, from physical form to sacred memory. The next time you hesitate over a chipped heirloom or worn-out tool, consider this ancient wisdom. Perhaps nothing is ever truly used up, only waiting to be reconsecrated. This mindset extended beyond temples and texts into the heart of daily life. In rural Ireland, families still speak of the holy midden, a compost pile where kitchen scraps mixed with palm fronds from Easter services created soil so fertile it was said to bless the crops. Moroccan courtyards hid broken pottery beneath olive trees, believing the shards retained baraka blessing that nourished the roots. Even colonial American housewives saved threadbare baptismal gowns to line baby cradles, stitching protection from sacred rags. The genius of these practices lies in their duality. They weren't just spiritual acts but sustainable ones long before zero waste became a slogan. A Byzantine family recycling lamp oil into church candles, or a Balinese farmer offering coconut husks at a temple before mulching them weren't just being pious, they were pioneering closed-loop systems. This intersection of faith and function suggests a startling possibility. That ecological wisdom wasn't discovered by modern science, but remembered from ancient reverence. Archaeologists find proof in the humblest places. Beneath the floorboards of Viking longhouses, they uncover carefully placed animal bones, not food waste but household guardians. In Pompeian kitchens, broken amphorae became herb planters, their curves still bearing soot from nightly prayers to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Even the placement mattered. Mayan homes buried ritual trash under doorways as spiritual thresholds, while Chinese farmhouses stacked worn-out tools in earth god niches. Perhaps this domestic sacred trash holds the most enduring lesson. It reminds us that holiness wasn't confined to temples. It lived in the cracks and corners of everyday life, in the way people handled what others might overlook. A child's broken toy given a ceremonial burial, a grandmother's threadbare shawl repurposed as an altar cloth. These weren't acts of frugality but of faith. They whispered that nothing truly cherished ever becomes garbage, only changes form. Beneath the floor of a Roman villa, buried under the doorway, archaeologists often find a curious assortment: broken toys, worn-out sandals, even cracked dishes. These weren't careless discards, they were deliberate deposits, placed there by families seeking protection from the spirits they believed lurked at thresholds. For these households, the act of disposal wasn't just practical, it was sacred. A child's chipped doll, carefully interred beneath the entrance, became a guardian. A shattered oil lamp tucked into the foundation transformed into a ward against misfortune. This wasn't grand temple ritual. This was the quiet spirituality of everyday life, where even trash could hold power. The medieval world took this idea even further. In the dim corners of European cottages, families saved seemingly worthless items, nail clippings, strands of hair, even baby teeth, wrapping them in cloth or sealing them in tiny pouches. To modern eyes, these might look like odd keepsakes, but to their owners, they were potent charms. The belief was simple: anything that had once been part of the body still carried a fragment of the soul. Discarding it carelessly risked leaving that essence vulnerable to dark forces. So instead, these intimate wastes were preserved, sometimes hidden in walls or sewn into clothing, blending the mundane with the mystical. This practice wasn't confined to Europe. In Japan, the ritual of Yuma legendary mountains where the elderly were abandoned may have roots in a more nuanced tradition. Families leaving offerings of personal items to symbolically accompany ancestors into the next world. Even something as ordinary as a worn-out comb placed at a grave could become a bridge between worlds. Similarly, in West Africa, Yoruba households buried broken cooking pots upside down near doorways, believing their inverted forms trapped negative energy. Every culture had its own version of this domestic alchemy, turning the discarded into the divine. Fast forward to today, and echoes of these rituals linger in surprising places. The modern tradition of saving baby teeth under pillows for the tooth fairy isn't just a whimsical custom, it's a faint remnant of ancient beliefs about the power held in bodily fragments. In parts of Latin America, parents still tuck a child's first haircut into amulets for protection. Even our reluctance to throw away inherited quilts or cracked family heirlooms speaks to this deep-seated instinct that objects charged with memory transcend their material form. But here's the twist: these practices weren't just about superstition. They were social equalizers. While temple rituals often required wealth, fine oils, precious metals, household sacred waste demanded nothing more than what people already had. A peasant's broken bowl, buried with intention, held as much spiritual weight as a noble's gilded offering. This democratization of the sacred reveals a profound truth: holiness wasn't reserved for the elite. It could be found in the cracks and crevices of ordinary life, accessible to anyone willing to see potential in what others dismissed. The layers of meaning in these small acts are staggering. A medieval midden wasn't just a trash heap, it was a ledger of lives lived. The worn-out spindle whorl tossed into a Viking household's refuse pit tells us about women's labor. The fish bones in a coastal midden trace seasonal migrations. Even the placement of these deposits mattered. Roman families often buried broken items near hearths, turning domestic waste into a silent dialogue with the gods of home and hearth. Every shattered piece was a sentence in an ongoing conversation between the earthly and the eternal. What emerges from these fragments is a radical idea that nothing was ever truly useless. A cracked jar became a votive. A child's lost tooth became a talisman. In a world without landfills, every object had a second act, a hidden purpose waiting to be unlocked. And that's where the story takes its next turn, because if sacred trash could shape homes, it could also shape empires. The way societies handled their refuse didn't just reflect their beliefs, it reinforced their hierarchies, from slave quarters to royal palaces. The remnants of daily life, it turns out, held power far beyond the spiritual. They were mirrors of the societies that created them. In ancient Egypt, the act of disposing a cracked offering bowl wasn't just housekeeping. It was high-stakes diplomacy with the gods. Only the highest-ranking priests could handle these sacred fragments, carefully wrapping them in linen before burial in temple pits. This wasn't mere sanitation, it was a monopoly on spiritual power. The same pattern emerges in the Inca Empire, where noble families controlled the placement of midden layers beneath new palaces, literally building their authority atop curated refuse. These weren't random assignments, they were calculated displays of dominance, proving that those who controlled a society's sacred trash controlled its connection to the divine. The flip side reveals a darker truth. While elites managed holy refuse, marginalized groups were often forced into contact with unclean waste. In Vedic India, the Chandala caste handled corpses and sewage, their very touch considered polluting. Mesopotamian temple workers sorted ritually pure offerings upstairs while slaves scrubbed latrines below, a physical manifestation of the sacred-profane divide. Even in death, this hierarchy held. Egyptian tomb builders received proper burials, while the laborers who hauled away embalming waste were buried in unmarked pits. These divisions weren't just about hygiene, they were spiritual apartheid, with waste management as the visible boundary. Archaeology exposes these power plays in startling detail. At Teotihuacan, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent contains a mass grave of sacrificial victims, but deeper excavations revealed something subtler. Beneath the pyramid stairs lay carefully arranged layers of shattered incense burners, placed there during construction by elite priests. Meanwhile, the city's outskirts held vast middens where commoners dumped household waste, untouched by ceremony. The message was clear: sacred trash belonged to the powerful, profane waste to the powerless. This control extended beyond physical objects to the very narratives they represented. When Aztec priests archived broken ritual objects in temple cellars, they weren't just storing debris, they were curating official history. Similarly, Roman pontiffs decided which votive offerings could be melted down for reuse and which must be preserved, effectively editing the archaeological record centuries before excavation. The ability to declare what trash mattered and what didn't was the ultimate cultural veto power, yet cracks in this system sometimes appeared. At Çatalhöyük, analysis of house middens shows surprising equality. Each dwelling maintained its own ritual deposits, suggesting shared spiritual authority. And in Norse Greenland, thralls' slaves participated in sacred waste rituals typically reserved for elites, blending cultural boundaries through shared practice. These exceptions prove the rule: where waste hierarchies weakened, so too did social divisions. The gendered dimensions of this power dynamic were equally revealing. While male priests often controlled temple refuse, women frequently managed household sacred waste, from burying umbilical cords to curating family midden shrines. This domestic spiritual labor, though less documented, formed the bedrock of communal memory. A Phoenician mother saving her child's first haircut in a wall niche exercised the same archival instinct as a pharaoh's funerary priest, just on a smaller scale. Tomorrow's archaeologists may well puzzle over our own waste hierarchies, the carefully preserved time capsules versus the mountains of landfill debris. The lesson from history is clear. What a society chooses to sanctify or scrap speaks volumes about who holds the pen to its collective story. And often, the most revealing chapters aren't written in gold, but in the fragments deemed both too trivial to keep and too meaningful to throw away. The loom weights tucked beneath an ancient Greek woman's floor weren't just forgotten tools, they were silent testaments to generations of domestic devotion. Pressed into the earth with deliberate care, these worn clay discs carried fingerprints from grandmother to mother to daughter, transforming household waste into spiritual anchors. This wasn't unique to Greece. Across cultures, women turned the mundane act of disposal into sacred ritual, curating family memory through objects others might overlook. In Japan's imperial court, shrine maidens known as miko ceremonially retired broken ritual mirrors by submerging them in sacred streams, their reflective surfaces, though cracked, still believed to hold traces of the divine. These acts reveal a hidden truth. Where temples celebrated grand monuments, homes sanctified the small. Modern archaeology is only beginning to unravel these gendered narratives. At Çatalhöyük, researchers found infant burials cradled in baskets lined with textile scraps, each frayed edge placed with intention by mothers weaving protection for the afterlife. Viking longhouses yielded worn spindle walls repurposed as funeral talismans, their grooves smoothed by years of women's labor now guarding the dead. Even the humble act of saving umbilical cords, practiced from Mesoamerica to Mongolia, transformed biological waste into potent amulets, with women preserving these dried remnants in wall niches or family altars. These weren't sentimental gestures but sacred contracts, binding generations through curated decay. The power dynamics here are revelatory. While male priests controlled temple refuse, women's dominion over domestic trash carried its own spiritual weight. Roman matrons buried broken household idols beneath doorways as protective wards, their placement mapping private devotion onto domestic space. In West Africa, Yoruba women still conduct annual ceremonies to retire old cooking pots, chanting as they return cracked vessels to riverbeds, a ritual recycling echoing ancient Midden practices. This duality, public versus private, institutional versus intimate, shows how gender shaped waste's journey from practical to sacred. Yet these roles weren't merely passive. Some of history's most subversive acts were hidden in plain sight, disguised as domestic duty. During Japan's Edo period, persecuted Christians smuggled broken rosary beads into household trash piles, their presence camouflaged among mundane debris. Ulster women in 17th century Ireland sewn forbidden Gaelic charms into the linings of discarded baby swaddling, turning midden heaps into secret archives of resistance. Even the placement mattered. Byzantine women's habit of interring broken fertility, amulets near imperial granaries may have been spiritual sabotage, using trash magic to protest grain taxes. What emerges is a radical redefinition of women's work. The careful sorting of hearth ashes in medieval England saved for lye soap or scattered as ritual purification wasn't just housekeeping but alchemy. A Navajo grandmother's practice of orienting worn-out moccasins toward the sunrise before burial wasn't disposal but cosmology in action. These acts blurred the line between chore and ceremony, proving that sacredness wasn't confined to temples but flourished wherever intention transformed the overlooked. Nowhere is this more poignant than in the unmarked graves of enslaved women, where archaeologists find buttons arranged in protective sigils or rusted scissors placed as both tool and talisman. These quiet acts of defiance using the master's discarded objects as sacred armor reveal waste's power to sustain identity under oppression. Similarly, Victorian housemaids hid broken teacups beneath floorboards as folkloric warnings against abusive employers, turning domestic debris into covert rebellion. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. What societies label as trash often carries the sharpest truths. The worn grinding stones Pueblo women retired to shrine caves weren't just worn-out tools, they were diaries in stone, their grooves recording seasons of drought and abundance. The chipped fertility figurines Roman matrons buried in garden plots weren't mere discards but hopeful petitions, pressed into the earth like seeds. In a world that often silenced women's voices, their sacred refuse spoke volumes if we're willing to listen. This sets the stage for an even more provocative chapter in our story. how marginalized groups weaponized waste itself, turning society's cast-offs into tools of protest and survival. From the enslaved Africans who encoded escape routes in broken pottery patterns to the suffragettes who smuggled messages in discarded hatpins, sacred trash became the ultimate act of defiance, proof that what the powerful throw away, the oppressed can transform into power. Buried beneath the floorboards of a Roman villa, a shattered statuette of Venus might seem like careless debris until you notice the tiny cross scratched into its base. This wasn't accidental damage, it was an act of quiet rebellion. Early Christians facing persecution repurposed broken pagan idols as covert altars, turning the empire's sacred trash into their own hidden shrines. The very objects Rome discarded became vessels of resistance, their fractures masking a faith that refused to die. Across the ocean centuries later, enslaved Yoruba people in Brazil pressed cowrie shells into the dirt of plantation middens, seemingly random refuse, but to initiates, these were secret signatures of the Orishas, disguised as everyday waste to avoid detection. The genius of these acts lay in their dual nature. What looked like carelessness to oppressors was careful curation to the oppressed. In colonial Peru, Andean weavers intentionally frayed Spanish-style textiles before burying them with traditional offerings, creating archaeological palimpsests that masked indigenous survival beneath layers of apparent assimilation. Similarly, Jewish communities in medieval Europe hid Torah fragments in Genesis storage not just for sanctity, but as defiance. These worn scraps became time capsules of identity during forced conversions. The pattern repeats globally, from Aboriginal Australians embedding songlines in seemingly random shell arrangements to Irish tenants weaving political messages into the thatch of fairy forts built over ancient middens. Modern folk artists continue this tradition of coded resistance. The bottle tree sculptures of the American South, originally created by enslaved people from discarded liquor bottles, transformed plantation waste into spiritual guardians against oppression. Today, Haitian artists forge intricate Vodou flags from recycled tapestries and sequins, their shimmering surfaces proclaiming sacred narratives through society's cast-offs. In South Africa's townships, wire artists twist discarded telephone cables into elaborate sculptures, echoing the Zulu practice of weaving protective amulets from battlefield debris. Each piece carries forward an ancient truth: what the powerful discard, the marginalized can redeem. Archaeology now confirms how systematic these practices were. At Maryland's Y House plantation, excavations revealed West African-style charms deliberately placed in slave quarter trash pits, broken pipes arranged in protective sigils, animal bones aligned with celestial patterns. These weren't haphazard disposals but sacred geographies, mapping memories of a stolen homeland onto unfamiliar soil. Similarly, beneath Mexico City's cathedral, Aztec ritual objects lie jumbled with Spanish construction debris, not random mixing, but indigenous workers secretly consecrating colonial architecture with ancestral fragments. The most poignant examples emerge from cultural collisions. Inuit soapstone carvers under missionary rule produced crucifix figures with hidden shamanic motifs on their bases, visible only when overturned. Japanese hidden Christians, Kakyo preserved their faith during Prohibition by fashioning Virgin Mary statues disguised as canon bodhisattvas, their true identity revealed only by a cross subtly etched where the base would conceal it. These objects embody a heartbreaking brilliance, using the appearance of discarded tradition to safeguard its living heart. What makes these acts of sacred resistance so powerful is their inversion of value. Where oppressors saw worthless trash, the oppressed saw potential relics. the Roma people's tradition of crafting musical instruments from discarded wood and tin instruments, later banned as nuisances, turned urban waste into cultural lifelines. Appalachian coal miners' wives repurposed glass shards from company stores as memory jugs, embedding buttons, nails, and photos in resin to commemorate lives the industry treated as disposable. Even today, Palestinian embroidery artists incorporate shredded political posters into traditional tatrees patterns, stitching protest into heritage. This legacy challenges our most basic assumptions about power and preservation. The very items meant to be erased, broken idols, banned symbols, discarded tools, became the most resilient. Like the Navajo weavers who intentionally include a spirit line, flaw in their rugs to let creativity escape, these acts of sacred recycling acknowledge that perfection isn't preservation. Sometimes survival looks like a carefully placed crack. As we turn next to the science preserving these fragile testaments, remember, the most enduring histories aren't always written in ink, but in the quiet language of objects the world tried to throw away. A cracked leather sandal buried in the Egyptian desert for 3,000 years emerges almost intact, its stitching still visible. A bundle of ritual herbs tossed into an Irish bog 2 millennia ago retains its vibrant green hue, as if plucked yesterday. These aren't miracles of chance, they're triumphs of chemistry, where the very elements that should have destroyed these objects instead became their eternal guardians. The survival of sacred trash across millennia hinges on invisible collaborations between human intention and environmental alchemy, turning soil and climate into silent archivists. Take the arid deserts of Peru's coast, where the Nazca people deliberately placed ritual offerings in dry sand. The lack of moisture halted bacterial decay, preserving fragile materials like cotton shrouds and feather headdresses that would have crumbled elsewhere. Similarly, in Xinjiang's Taklamakan Desert, the Tarim mummies clad in brilliantly colored woolens were saved not by embalming but by salt. As groundwater evaporated, mineral deposits encased bodies and textiles in a protective crystalline embrace, freezing them in time. These natural processes didn't just preserve objects, they captured moments. A half-eaten ritual meal in the Indus Valley, its barley grain still bearing tooth marks, or the olive pits in Masada's storerooms, their oil still chemically detectable after 2,000 years. Bogs tell an even stranger tale. When Celtic tribes deposited butter offerings in Irish wetlands, they unknowingly leveraged anaerobic power. The oxygen-starved, acidic waters prevented microbial decay, while tannins from sphagnum moss tanned leather and wood like natural vats. The famous bog bodies, often surrounded by ritual debris, weren't intentionally mummified. The environment did the work, turning human remains into eerie time capsules alongside their accompanying sacred trash. This chemical custody extends to Alaska's permafrost, where frozen middens preserve salmon bones and berry seeds in icy suspension, allowing scientists to reconstruct ancestral diets with startling precision. Then there's disaster's unexpected gift. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, its superheated gas didn't just carbonize Pompeii's bread loaves, it sealed entire neighborhoods in volcanic ash, creating casts of decaying organic matter. A woven basket of ritual figs, left mid-offering, was fossilized in seconds, its carbonized remains holding their shape like a shadow. Similar phenomena occurred at Turkey's Çatalhöyük, where frequent plastering of walls trapped domestic refuse between layers, accidentally creating a stratigraphic diary of daily life. Even earthquakes played preservational roles. At Teotihuacan, collapsed temple walls entombed broken ritual masks in airtight pockets, shielding their pigments from sunlight and air. The real revelation lies in what these processes preserve together. At Denmark's Alken Inge, an entire wetland battlefield became a sacred deposit, with iron weapons and human bones fused by rust into a single archaeological conglomerate. The chemical interplay between metal oxides and bog acids created a preservation feedback loop. Sword edges corroded in just the right way to encase nearby textiles in mineral sheaths. Similarly, in China's Mawangdui tombs, layered lacquer vessels and silk manuscripts survived because designers engineered an airtight charcoal barrier, controlling humidity through intentional chemistry centuries before modern conservation science. These environmental collaborations raise profound questions about intentionality. Did ancient cultures recognize these preservative properties? The Mayas' placement of rubber offerings in cenotes suggests they understood water's protective role, while Egyptian priests' use of natron salt for mummification reveals a grasp of desiccation science. Perhaps most striking are the Inuit practices of freezing ritual objects in sea ice, a deliberate harnessing of cryopreservation that kept wooden masks and gutskin clothing intact for generations. This intersection of sacred geography and material science hints at sophisticated ecological knowledge, where disposal sites were chosen not just for symbolism but for their archival potential. Now science is decoding these ancient preservation codes to save fragile artifacts. Laboratories recreate bog conditions to stabilize newly excavated textiles, while 3D scans capture objects mid-decay, preserving them digitally as their physical forms succumb to time. Yet every breakthrough reveals new ethical tensions. How much should we disturb these time capsules? The answer may lie in the very chemistry we're studying, teaching us when to excavate and when to let the earth keep its secrets. Digging into an ancient midden might seem like harmless archaeology until you realize you're sifting through someone's sacred legacy. For many indigenous communities, these so-called trash piles are not abandoned relics but active spiritual sites, where every shell fragment or animal bone remains entwined with ancestral presence. The Tlingit people of Alaska describe the act of unearthing their shell middens as waking the sleepers, disturbing spirits who are meant to rest undisturbed. This tension between scientific curiosity and cultural reverence has sparked fierce debates. Does the value of knowledge outweigh the right of the dead and the living to peace? Museums wrestling with these questions face impossible choices. Take the case of the Haida Gwaii totem poles, once displayed as art in distant galleries, but later repatriated and allowed to decay naturally in their homeland as tradition dictated. Now imagine applying that logic to sacred refuse should a 2,000-year-old offering bowl, carefully buried by Inca priests, be displayed behind glass or reburied with ceremony. Some institutions are finding middle ground. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian now consults tribal elders before exhibiting ritual objects, sometimes draping sensitive items in cloth or limiting photography. Others, like New Zealand's Te Papa, have created wahai tapu, sacred spaces within galleries where Maori ancestral remains and artifacts can rest undisturbed yet still be acknowledged. The ethical dilemmas multiply when sacred trash becomes tourist spectacle. At Mexico's Templo Maya, visitors peer into pits filled with Aztec ritual debris, broken skulls from sacrifices, shattered copal incense burners, once hidden deep beneath the temple floor. Local Nahua descendants argue these objects were meant to stay concealed, their power contained. Similar conflicts simmer at Scotland's Skara Brae, where Neolithic midden layers exposed by storms draw crowds, despite Orkney Islanders' concerns about disturbing what they call the Old One's pantry. The commercialization of these sites raises uncomfortable questions. Is it education or exploitation when sacred refuse becomes a photo op? Yet some collaborations offer hope. In British Columbia, the Heiltsuk Nation partners with archaeologists to study ancient fish bones from middens, not as detached scientists but as knowledge keepers. Their findings now support modern land claims, proving ancestral stewardship of salmon runs for millennia. In Australia, Aboriginal rangers guide controlled excavations at shell Middens sites, deciding which layers can be studied and which must remain sealed. These models flip traditional power dynamics, treating descendant communities not as obstacles but as co-curators of their own history. The heart of these debates lies in conflicting concepts of time. Western archaeology often views the past as a puzzle to solve, while many indigenous traditions see it as a living continuum. A broken pot in a museum case is art to one culture and a great-great-grandmother's cooking vessel to another. Perhaps the way forward isn't choosing between these perspectives, but finding intersections like the Maori practice of kaishiakatanga, where sacred objects are temporarily studied for community benefit before returning to the earth. As sacred trash tourism grows, so does the urgency of these conversations. Visitors scrambling over Peru's huacas for selfies or pocketing shards from Scottish brocks might not realize they're treating spiritual archives as souvenirs. The solution may lie in reimagining access altogether, like Bhutan's cliffside monasteries, where revered sites are visible but untouchable, teaching through awe rather than intrusion. After all, some truths don't need to be held in the hand to be felt in the heart. Now consider the fate of a single cracked offering plate, once cherished, then carefully buried, now displayed under LED lights. Its journey forces us to ask, who gets to decide when sacred trash stops being sacred? The answer might determine whether our legacy is one of understanding, or just another layer in history's midden, waiting to be judged by those who come after us. Standing in line to peer into Pompeii's ancient garbage pits, few tourists realize they're part of a modern paradox, the very act of loving these sites to death. Each season, millions shuffle past broken amphorae and carbonized bread loaves, their footsteps vibrating fragile layers of history, while opportunistic fingers slip sacred shards into pockets as macabre souvenirs. This isn't just happening in Italy. From Peru's Nazca lines where drone flights erode sacred geoglyphs, to Kyoto's moss gardens trampled by selfie sticks, sacred trash tourism has become a double-edged sword. The dilemma cuts deep. How do we share cultural treasures without turning them into casualties of curiosity? Some communities have drawn hard lines. At Japan's Ai's Grand Shrine, the sacred waste repository, where retired ritual objects are ceremonially stored, remains strictly off-limits to visitors. The shrine's priests follow a 2,000-year tradition called Shikinen Sengu, rebuilding the entire complex every 20 years using precise ancient techniques. Discarded materials from the old shrine aren't displayed as artifacts but treated with ongoing reverence, buried in consecrated ground. This practice, known as Kami no Kakurega, the god's hiding place, reflects a radical philosophy. Some sacred trash isn't meant for outsider eyes at all. Similar restrictions protect Australia's Aboriginal shell middens, where many sites now require Indigenous rangers as guides to prevent spiritual and ecological damage. Yet other cultures have chosen controlled engagement over isolation. Mexico's Templo Mayor Museum made an unprecedented decision. Glass floors now allow visitors to walk above Aztec ritual waste pits without disturbing the sacred debris beneath. Motion sensors trigger subtle lighting to highlight offerings only when someone pauses, reducing constant exposure. In Norway's Lofoten Islands, Viking Midden sites feature raised boardwalks with tactile replicas that blind and sighted visitors can handle, while the actual archaeological layers remain protected below. These innovations acknowledge a painful truth. Total exclusion often fuels more destructive clandestine tourism, as seen when Bulgaria's Perpignan complex saw looting spike after researchers restricted access. The economic pressures add another layer of complexity. For small communities like Scotland's Orkney Islands, Neolithic midden tours provide vital income, but at what cost? Recent studies show that the salt from visitors' breath and skin oils is accelerating decay in the 5,000-year-old Skara Bree settlement. Some villages now implement rest rotations, closing sections periodically like crop fields lying fallow. Meanwhile, Hawaii's Ahu sacred trash heaps present a different challenge. Traditional protocols demand ceremonial protocols before any interaction, but tour operators often bypass these customs for efficiency. The result, spiritual backlash, like the 2019 protests that shut down unauthorized hikes to Maui's Kaiwiki Hill Midden Caves. Technology offers unexpected compromises. Virtual reality now allows visits to sensitive sites like the Inuit Cactu waste cairns in Greenland's melting permafrost, places too fragile for physical tourism, but culturally essential to share. At Israel's Beit She'arim necropolis, augmented reality glasses overlay digital reconstructions onto the actual catacombs, letting tourists see how sacred trash deposits originally appeared without touching them. Even blockchain enters the equation. The British Museum now mints NFTs of documented midden artifacts, with proceeds funding conservation while keeping the physical objects protected. The most promising solutions emerge from collaborative models. In British Columbia, the Hailtsuk Nation trains tourists as citizen archaeologists, allowing carefully supervised documentation of coastal middens in exchange for hands-on conservation work. Belize's Acton Tunishil Mucknell Cave, home to Maya ritual waste deposits, permits small groups led by Maya descendants who determine what can be photographed or approached. These approaches reframe tourism from extraction to exchange, where visitors become temporary stewards rather than passive consumers. The question lingers, can sacred trash be both worshipped and witnessed? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that some layers are meant to stay buried, not out of secrecy, but respect. Like the Japanese practice of wabi sabi, finding beauty in impermanence, we might learn that true appreciation sometimes means knowing when to step back, leaving the past's fragile remnants to whisper their stories undisturbed. The future of sacred waste tourism won't be found in unlimited access or absolute lockdown, but in the delicate balance between memory and modernity, where every footprint, real or digital, carries the weight of responsibility. A deleted selfie, a corrupted spreadsheet, an abandoned social media account, these digital fragments might seem like modern clutter, but they're already becoming sacred artifacts in their own right. Digital archaeologists are sifting through forgotten hard drives and obsolete servers, recovering everything from early memes to lost manuscripts, treating each recovered file with the same reverence once reserved for temple offerings. Consider the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which preserves defunct websites like digital middens, layers of code stacking up like ancient shell heaps. Even failed startup servers now serve as accidental time capsules, their broken links and error messages forming a new kind of sacred refused digital pottery shards from the early 21st century. Artificial intelligence is reshaping this landscape in eerie ways. Machine learning can now reconstruct lost files from corrupted data, stitching together digital ghosts from fragments. Artists use AI to resurrect deleted photos, creating haunting composites of forgotten faces, a process uncomfortably close to summoning. In Japan, there's even a Buddhist chatbot that conducts memorial services for deleted files, reciting sutras for expired data as if it were ancestral spirits. These practices echo ancient traditions where broken objects were believed to retain spiritual residue, blurring the line between recycling and ritual. The most profound shift, though, may be in how we conceptualize disposal itself. physical trash leaves traces. A crumpled receipt, a shattered vase, but digital waste vanishes with a click. Or does it? Password-protected journals, encrypted cryptocurrency wallets, and even abandoned Minecraft worlds take on new significance as intentionally hidden relics. Like the Maya's ritual caves filled with broken pottery, our encrypted drives and forgotten cloud folders become modern sacred repositories, deliberately placed beyond casual access, yet preserved for reasons we can't always articulate. Some communities are already formalizing these instincts. The Dead Projects Museum in Lithuania curates failed tech startups' code like sacred scrolls, displaying error messages as poetic epitaphs. In San Francisco, a collective called the Archive of Missing Things uses blockchain to immortalize deleted social media posts, turning viral trash into permanent, tokenized art. Even mainstream platforms grapple with this shift. Facebook's memorialized accounts function like digital tombs, where grief unfolds in comment sections instead of burial grounds. What makes these digital remnants sacred isn't their utility but their vulnerability. A recovered GeoCities page from 1996 holds more cultural weight than 1,000 current blogs, precisely because it survived against the odds. Like the charred seeds in an ancient hearth, their value lies in their fragility, in the stories they carry about a world that no longer exists. The future of sacred trash may not pile up in physical mounds but float in the cloud, password-protected, fragmentary, waiting for someone to remember the encryption key. Yet this intangible refuse raises urgent questions. Who decides what digital debris gets preserved? An Instagram post might be trash to its creator, but sacred to a future historian studying early influencer culture. The environmental cost adds another layer. While ancient shell middens enrich the soil, today's data centers drain rivers to cool servers storing billions of forgotten selfies. Perhaps the next spiritual challenge won't be learning to venerate our waste, but learning when to let it dissolve. As we hover between physical and digital sacred trash, one thing becomes clear: the urge to sanctify our refuse isn't disappearing, it's evolving. The same impulse that led an Inca priest to bury a cracked cup now leads a programmer to archive old code. Whether carved in clay or coded in binary, our trash remains the most honest monument we leave behind. The only difference: future archaeologists will need passwords instead of shovels. From the shell middens of coastal tribes to the encrypted fragments in our cloud storage, humanity's sacred trash tells a story far richer than mere disposal. It's a narrative etched in broken pottery and deleted files, proof that what we cast away often carries the deepest echoes of who we are. Consider the humble compost pile in your backyard, where you see coffee grounds and banana peels. The Olone people saw offerings returning to the earth, their community middens carefully layered with shells and ashes to nourish future harvests. This ancient wisdom whispers that waste isn't an endpoint but a transformation, one we're only beginning to relearn. Modern landfills might seem worlds apart from temple offering pits, but the connective threads are there if you know where to look. In Kamakatsu, Japan, residents sort trash into 45 categories with ritual precision, their recycling center as meticulously organized as any reliquary. Artists like El Anatsui stitch aluminum bottle caps into shimmering tapestries, elevating litter to the status of cathedral windows. Even our digital habits mirror old instincts. Why do we hoard old text messages or screenshot fading Snapchats, if not from some deep-seated sense that these ephemeral fragments hold meaning? The sacred has simply migrated from physical shards to digital shadows. The urgent lesson from these traditions isn't about romanticizing the past, but recognizing the profound costs of our throwaway present. Ancient middens localized decay in harmony with ecosystems, while our plastic gyres spiral across oceans. Sacred trash pits were curated archives, but today's algorithms erase cultural memory with every platform shut down. Yet glimmers of change suggest a way forward. Bali's trash temple movement cleans beaches before offering sorted plastics at shrines, fusing ecology with devotion. Architects study the Inca's rubble-filled terraces stable for centuries as models for sustainable construction. Even corporations are catching on. Patagonia's worn-wear program repairs old gear with near-religious fervor, their technicians acting like modern-day votive priests tending to sacred objects. What makes these examples transformative is their acknowledgement of waste's emotional weight. The Japanese festival of Hare-Kuyo, where broken needles are thanked for their service, understands what our recycling bins ignore, that objects carry stories. When archaeologists sift through Roman garbage dumps, they don't just catalog olive pits, they reconstruct entire social networks from wine amphory stamps. Your great-grandchildren might one day study discarded smartphone models like we study Mayan pottery shards, reading our values in the layers of planned obsolescence. This perspective shift could redefine sustainability altogether. Imagine cities where landfill sites become memory gardens like Ireland's holy Middens, their layers marked with plaques instead of plastic tarps. Envision tech companies designing for dignified retirement instead of deletion, creating digital ossuaries for retired apps. Picture museums displaying contemporary ritual objects, a child's worn sneakers, a barrister's cracked mug, with the same reverence given to Ming Dynasty vases. The materials haven't changed, only our willingness to see their worth. As you close this tab or swipe to the next video, take a moment with whatever's destined for your trash today. That yogurt container, expired coupon, or dead battery, what would it mean to treat it not as garbage but as an artifact in the making, not with guilt but with the purposeful care of an Inca mason folding broken tools into temple foundations? The sacred never demanded perfection, only attention. And in a world drowning in waste, that attention might be the most radical act of preservation left to us. Thanks for exploring these layers of history with me. If this journey through time's forgotten treasures resonated, I'd love to hear what fragments of your life feel unexpectedly sacred in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning what gets left.